The air in Willow Creek's community center hung thick with the smell of stale coffee and the sharper scent of judgment. You know those cookie-cutter suburbs America loves to sell. Manicured lawns that look like they've been vacuumed, mailboxes painted the exact shade of beige the HOA demands, kids on bikes pretending it's still the 1950s? That's Willow Creek, population 2,847, sole optional. On paper, it's paradise. In reality, it's a police state run by one woman, Karen Blackwell, president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association for the last 18 years and counting. Karen didn't just enforce rules. She weaponized them. Grass must be exactly 2.5 inches. No more, no less, or you get a $250 fine and a cheerful letter signed, with community love, Karen. American flags could fly for 3 days max. Then they had to come down, or you were disrespecting the aesthetic. Don't even think about parking your own car in your own driveway if it had a dent. That was visual blight. And God forbid you missed the annual Unity Barbecue, where Karen gave her annual speech about sacrificing for the greater good of property values. She said that word, sacrifice, like it was a holy sacrament while she sipped Chardonnay and tallied violation points. I was Eleanor Vance, 47, divorced, and a quiet resident at the end of Maple Lane. I paid my dues on time. I kept my shutters the approved neutral taupe. I smiled politely at the monthly meetings and never once raised my hand. Most people thought I was the perfect neighbor. Karen knew better. She had decided years ago that I was the weak link, the one who might actually have a spine, and she set out to break it in public. It hadn't always been like this. 15 years earlier, my 8-year-old daughter Sophie had been dying. Rare autoimmune kidney disease, genetic, the doctor said quietly, inherited from me. The guilt alone could have killed me faster than the surgery. We scoured every registry, every relative. No match. Then the transplant coordinator pulled me aside one rainy Tuesday and whispered the impossible. I was a perfect match. The carrier of the faulty gene was also the only living donor on the planet who could save her. I didn't hesitate, but I made one ironclad condition. The donor had to stay anonymous. Sophie could never know it was me. I didn't want her growing up with the weight of a life debt staring back at her every morning. I wanted her to be free. Free to be angry at me for normal mom reasons. Free to roll her eyes at my cooking. Free to live without owing her very existence to the woman who gave birth to her. The surgeon promised. The records were sealed. Only 3 people in the world knew. Me, the doctor, and my then-husband David. The surgery was brutal. I woke up with 1 kidney and a scar that felt like it bisected my soul. Recovery was slower than anyone predicted. I couldn't mow the lawn for months. Couldn't stand long enough to paint the shutters the required color. Couldn't drag myself to Karen's mandatory welcome new neighbors potlucks. The first violation notice arrived while I was still on painkillers. Failure to maintain curb appeal during medical leave does not exempt you from standards. Karen herself delivered the certified letter, smiling like a shark in pearls. We all have to make sacrifices, Eleanor dear. Property values affect everyone. David saw his opening the same week. He'd always hated mess, hated imperfection, hated anything that made him look less than the perfect suburban dad. While I was still hooked to IVs, he started whispering to 8-year-old Sophie that mommy was resting too much now that she was better. He moved out 6 months later, taking Sophie with him to the big house on the hill, Karen Street, of course. And Karen welcomed them with open arms and a fresh batch of cookies. Poor thing, she told the neighborhood ladies at book club, loud enough for me to hear later. Eleanor just checked out after the transplant drama. Some mothers aren't built for the long haul. I kept my mouth shut. Every time Sophie came over on weekends and asked why I never came to her soccer games anymore, I swallowed the truth. Every time a new fine arrived, $175 for emotional support flag, an American flag I'd hung for 4 days after Sophie's birthday, $300 for visible recovery equipment, a single walker on my porch for 2 weeks. I wrote the check and said nothing. I watched Karen's empire grow. I watched her turn my daughter against me, one carefully placed rumor at a time. Your mom just doesn't seem to care about our community anymore. Karen would sigh at the HOA meetings while Sophie sat in the front row, nodding along like a trained seal. 15 years of silence. 15 years of watching my own child believe I had abandoned her the second she stopped being sick. 15 years of Karen using my recovery as proof that I was the neighborhood's worst mother and worst neighbor rolled into one. And now, here we were. The hearing that would decide whether the house my parents left me, the last piece of real inheritance I had, would stay mine or get slapped with a lien so massive I'd have to sell and leave Willow Creek forever. Karen called it enforcing compliance. I called it the final chapter of her masterpiece. The room was packed tonight. Neighbors I used to barbecue with now clutched clipboards like weapons. At the head table sat Karen in her signature pastel blazer, pearls gleaming under the fluorescent lights. My ex David sat beside her as community consultant, looking smug in the way only men who've never been caught can. And then there was Sophie, 20 now, beautiful, brilliant, and staring at me with the same cold fury she'd worn for years. She wouldn't even meet my eyes. Karen stood first, voice syrupy and righteous. We hate to bring this to a formal hearing, friends. But Eleanor Vance has shown a clear pattern of neglect, not just to her property, but to this entire community. And sadly, even to her own family. She turned to Sophie with practiced concern. Sweetheart, would you like to share what you've experienced? The knife twisted deep. I sat perfectly still, knuckles white in my lap, the same promise I'd made 15 years ago burning in my chest like the scar on my side. I would not speak. I would not defend myself. Not yet. Sophie stood, voice trembling with genuine pain. It's like a switch flipped the day I got healthy. Mom was there every second I was sick, hospitals, dialysis, the whole nightmare. Then the transplant happened, and she disappeared. She stopped coming to my games. She stopped helping with homework. She let Dad have full custody without a fight. It was like she couldn't stand to look at me once I wasn't dying anymore. The room murmured in collective horror. Karen nodded solemnly, hand on Sophie's shoulder like a proud mother. Exactly. Some people simply aren't equipped for the daily work of being a parent or a neighbor. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why we cannot allow Eleanor to retain control of a property that affects all of our values. I didn't flinch. I had practiced this face for 15 years. But inside, something ancient and patient was waiting. Because I wasn't the only one who knew the truth. And tonight, in this ridiculous little community center that doubled as a kangaroo court, one man had finally decided he'd had enough of Karen Blackwell's empire of lies. The gavel. Well, Karen's little wooden mallet, she loved to bang like a dictator, sounded like a starter pistol for the second act of my public execution. Sophie sat back down, wiping angry tears that I knew were real. She believed every word she just said. That was the part that still gutted me more than any $500 fine ever could. My own daughter thought I had tossed her aside the moment she stopped needing round-the-clock care. And Karen had spent 15 years watering that lie like it was prize-winning roses. David leaned over and gave Sophie's shoulder a performative squeeze. You're so brave, honey, he murmured loud enough for the front 3 rows. We're just trying to protect the community, and you, from someone who checked out years ago. The hypocrisy was so thick you could spread it on toast. He'd been the one pushing the divorce papers while I was still in recovery, the one who'd moved Sophie into Karen's orbit, the one who'd nodded along every time Karen called me, that poor woman who just couldn't cope. Karen wasn't done. She paced in front of the folding tables like a prosecutor on television. Let's look at the record, shall we? Since the transplant, when Sophie finally got her life back, Eleanor has racked up 47 violations. 47. Unmowed lawn during recovery? Violation. Missed 3 Unity barbecues? Violation. Refused to replace her perfectly functional mailbox with a new, approved model that costs $400? Violation. And worst of all, she has contributed 0 hours to our community service projects. 0. While the rest of us sacrifice weekends painting the entrance sign or planting petunias, Eleanor, well, she's been resting. A few neighbors actually chuckled. Dark humor at its finest, laughing at a single mother who'd literally given a piece of herself to save her child, while Karen acted like missing a potluck was child abuse. I kept my eyes on the cheap laminate table, tracing the fake wood grain with my fingernail. Inside I was screaming, but the scream had been locked away since the day I signed those consent forms. Anonymous donor. Recipient never to be told. No exceptions. The hearing dragged on. More residents stood up, coached by Karen, to share their concerns. Mrs. Abernathy from 2 doors down complained that my Christmas lights had stayed up until January 12th. Clearly a cry for attention. Mr. Patel from the cul-de-sac said my recycling bin had once had a single can of soda in the wrong slot. Each story was more petty than the last, each one delivered with the solemn tone of people testifying at a war crimes tribunal. And through it all, Karen beamed, like a proud teacher whose students had finally learned to snitch. Then came the real blow. Karen turned to the board with theatrical sadness. We've tried to help her. We've offered payment plans. We've sent reminder letters. But Eleanor refuses to engage. And now her parents' trust is up for review. The house was left with a codicil that the beneficiary must remain in good standing with the HOA. We simply cannot allow someone with this pattern of neglect to retain title. For the good of the community. The room nodded like trained seals. Sophie looked at me, then, really looked, and the hatred in her eyes was so pure it almost knocked the air out of my lungs. You never fought for me, she whispered across the table, voice cracking. You never came to my graduation. You never even put up a single photo of us after I got better. It was like I stopped existing the day I stopped being sick. I wanted to reach across and tell her everything. I wanted to scream that I had lain in a hospital bed for weeks so she could run track and go to prom and live without the shadow of, I owe mom my life. But the promise I'd made to that 8-year-old girl was louder than my breaking heart. So I stayed silent. The same silence that had cost me 15 years of hugs, 15 years of, I love you, Mom, 15 years of being her mother in anything but name. Karen was practically glowing. I moved that we recommend the lien and begin the foreclosure process. All in favor. Hands shot up like Nazi salutes. David smirked. Sophie looked away. And I sat there, the woman who had literally carved a piece of herself out to save her child, being branded the ultimate deadbeat mom and deadbeat neighbor in one neat little HOA vote. But the universe has a sense of timing. Because at the very back of the room, on the hard metal folding chair he'd been forced to sit in as a character witness, Karen had subpoenaed Dr. Marcus Hayes, my old family physician, the man who had performed the surgery, slowly rose to his feet. His hands were shaking, but his voice, when it came, was steady as a scalpel. Your little kangaroo court, he said, loud enough that every head snapped around, is about to get a lesson in what real sacrifice looks like. Karen's smile froze mid-simper. Dr. Hayes, you've already been heard. Please sit down. He didn't. He started walking down the aisle like a man who had carried a secret too heavy for 15 years and was finally setting it down. Dr. Hayes kept walking, each step deliberate, briefcase swinging like a wrecking ball aimed straight at Karen's empire. The room went dead quiet, the kind of quiet you only hear right before a bomb goes off. Karen's face twitched, that perfect, practiced concern cracked just enough to show the panic underneath. Doctor, this is highly irregular. You are here as a courtesy witness regarding community standing, not to disrupt proceedings. He reached the front table, set the briefcase down with a soft thud that sounded louder than any gavel, and looked straight at Sophie. Not at Karen. Not at David. At my daughter. Young lady, he said, voice gentle but carrying, everything you just said is true on the surface. Your mother did pull away after the transplant. She'd missed the games and the birthdays and the everyday moments. But you've been fed a story that's missing the most important chapter. Karen's hand shot up like she was directing traffic. Dr. Hayes, patient confidentiality is something I'm about to break, he cut her off. Because watching a good woman be crucified for 15 years while the real architect of this mess sits there smiling has become medically intolerable. He clicked the briefcase open and pulled out a single thin folder. The room leaned forward as one. These are the original sealed medical records from October 12, 2010. The day an anonymous donor saved Sophie Vance's life. Sophie's face went pale. I felt the floor tilt under my chair. 15 years of silence, and now it was cracking open in the middle of Karen Blackwell's HOA circus. Dr. Hayes didn't rush. He was a master storyteller in a white coat. He described the tiny 8-year-old girl hooked to machines, the frantic search for a donor, the miracle that the mother was a perfect match. Then he dropped the hammer. The donor's only condition, non-negotiable, was that the recipient must never, ever be told the identity. She wanted her daughter to grow up free. No guilt, no debt, just a normal life. He turned to me, eyes soft. Eleanor Vance signed that consent form with her own blood still on the paperwork. She gave her kidney, her recovery, and then, for your sake, Sophie, she gave up being your mother in public so you wouldn't feel you owed her anything. The gasp that went through the room was audible. Sophie's hand flew to her mouth. Karen looked like someone had slapped her with her own clipboard. David's smug face drained of color so fast I thought he might faint. Dr. Hayes kept going, voice rising with quiet fury. While Eleanor was in recovery, barely able to walk, the first violation notices started. While she was silently mourning the relationship she'd sacrificed, Karen Blackwell here began the campaign. Poor Eleanor just checked out. Some mothers aren't built for it. Every missed event, every fine for neglect, was turned into proof that this woman didn't care. And you, he looked at David and Karen both. Used that sacrifice as ammunition to poison a child against the person who literally kept her alive. Sophie turned slowly toward Karen, the woman who had fed her ice cream and community spirit speeches for 15 years. You knew. Her voice was small, broken, and terrifyingly calm. All those times you told me Mom was selfish, that she abandoned me once I was healthy, you knew she gave me her kidney? Karen opened her mouth, pearls suddenly looking ridiculous against the red creeping up her neck. Now, sweetheart, we were only trying to. Don't. Sophie stood up so fast her chair scraped like nails on a chalkboard. You used me. You used my pain. You turned my mother's love into a weapon so you could keep finding her and controlling everyone. She looked at David. And you helped her. The room was no longer on Karen's side. Whispers turned to murmurs, turned to outright outrage. Mrs. Abernathy, who had just testified against me, actually muttered, "My God, the flag fine was for a kidney donor?" Even Mr. Patel looked ashamed. Karen tried one last desperate pivot. This doesn't change the violations. Rules are rules. The HOA Charter. Dr. Hayes slammed the folder on the table. The HOA Charter doesn't cover perjury or emotional abuse. And these records are now public. Good luck explaining to the state licensing board why you weaponized medical trauma for property value theater. I finally stood up. 15 years of silence, and my first words in this room were quiet, steady, and aimed straight at my daughter. I never wanted you to feel like you owed me your life, Sophie. I wanted you to have it. All of it. Free. The tears that spilled down her face weren't angry anymore. They were the kind that wash 15 years of lies away in seconds. She walked around the table and hugged me so hard I felt the scar on my side ache in the best possible way. Mom, she whispered, and the words sounded brand new. Karen was still sputtering, trying to call for order, but the board members were already standing, phones out, recording the meltdown for the neighborhood Facebook group. David slipped toward the side door like the rat he was. And Karen, Karen, finally looked small. The woman who had ruled Willow Creek with an iron clipboard now stood alone while her carefully curated kingdom turned on her in real time. The gavel never came down again. Karen tried. 3 pathetic little taps, but the room had already moved on without her. Neighbors who had spent years nodding along to her nonsense were now surrounding me and Sophie, offering awkward apologies and, in one glorious case, Mrs. Abernathy actually tearing up her own violation logbook right there in front of everyone. I had no idea, she kept saying, voice thick. I just thought you were difficult. Difficult. The word almost made me laugh. 15 years of being painted as the cold, neglectful mother and bad neighbor, all because I chose silence over credit. Dark humor at its finest. The HOA that prided itself on transparency had been built on the biggest lie of all. Sophie wouldn't let go of my hand. She kept glancing at Karen like she was seeing her for the first time, really seeing the woman who had fed her cookies and poison in equal measure. Every time I complained about you missing my events, she whispered, Karen would say, some people just aren't cut out for motherhood. Honey, we're your family now. The betrayal in her voice was raw, but underneath it, I heard something stronger, rage that was finally aimed at the right target. Karen tried one last Hail Mary. She smoothed her blazer, forced that plastic smile back into place, and addressed the room in her best concerned leader voice. Well, this has certainly been illuminating. Of course, we'll review the medical documentation, but the violations are still on record, and the charter clearly states. Save it, Sophie snapped, loud enough that half the room turned. You used my mother's sacrifice to fine her into oblivion. You used me to do it. I'm done. She looked around at the neighbors. And if anyone here still thinks Karen Blackwell should be running this HOA after what we just heard, you're as bad as she is. The silence that followed was beautiful. Then Mr. Patel raised his hand, actually raised it like we were still in a formal meeting, and said, I move we call an emergency vote to remove Karen Blackwell as president effective immediately. Seconded before Karen could even open her mouth. Hands shot up faster than they had for the lean. Karen stood there, pearls trembling, watching her life's work evaporate in under 5 minutes. David had already slunk out the side door. Smart man. The rest of us watched Karen gather her clipboard and her dignity, what was left of it, and walk out with her head high and her reputation in shreds. Someone started slow clapping. Then more joined. By the time the door closed behind her, the entire room was applauding the end of an era. Sophie and I slipped out into the evening air. The HOA neighborhood looked exactly the same. Perfect lawns glowing under streetlights, beige shutters gleaming, but it felt different. Lighter. Like someone had finally opened a window in a house that had been sealed for years. We walked to the little cafe outside the gates, the one Karen had always complained about because it didn't match the aesthetic. We ordered 2 coffees and sat at an outside table under strings of lights that would have been violation number 48 if Karen were still in charge. For a long time, we just sipped in silence, the good kind. Then Sophie set her cup down. Why didn't you ever tell me? Even after Dad left. Even when the fines got insane. Why carry it alone? I looked at my daughter, my brave, brilliant daughter who was finally seeing me, and told her the truth I'd held for 15 years. Because love isn't a loan, Sophie. It's not something you pay back with guilt or obligation. I wanted you to run track and fall in love and fight with me over curfew like normal kids do. I didn't want every hug to come with an invisible IOU attached. So I paid the price quietly. It was never about being a martyr. It was about being your mom. She cried then, quiet, healing tears, and I cried with her. 15 years of distance collapsed across a cafe table in under an hour. We didn't fix everything that night. There were still awkward gaps, still moments where she would look at me and see the woman she had hated for so long. But we started. Weekly coffees turned into dinners. Long phone calls about nothing important became the most important conversations of my life. The house stayed mine. The lien was dropped the next day by a very embarrassed board. Karen's fall was swift and, in true Willow Creek fashion, petty. The new president, Mr. Patel, of all people, sent her a certified letter citing failure to maintain community trust and gave her 30 days to sell her own house or face the same fines she'd loved dishing out. Last I heard, she moved to a condo complex with no HO. A rumor has it she still patrols the hallways measuring grass height on the welcome mat. But the real victory wasn't Karen's exile. It was the slow, beautiful rebuilding between me and Sophie. A year later, I sat in the front row of her college graduation, watching her walk across the stage in cap and gown. When she spotted me, she smiled, the real one, the one that reached her eyes, and mouthed, "Thank you, Mom." Not for the kidney, for the silence, for the love that had been strong enough to look like neglect so she could be free. The truth hadn't just set me free. It had set both of us free. And in the end, the HOA that had tried to destroy us ended up teaching us the only rule that actually matters. Real sacrifice doesn't need a clipboard or a fine or public applause. It just needs to be real. The months that followed felt like waking up after a long, fevered dream. Sophie started coming over unannounced, sometimes just to raid the fridge and complain about her professors, sometimes to sit on the porch swing I'd finally been allowed to install without a permit. We didn't talk about Karen every day, but her ghost lingered in the little things. The way Sophie would suddenly go quiet when she saw an HOA sticker on a mailbox, or the way she'd hug me a second longer than necessary, like she was making up for 15 years of lost time. The neighborhood changed too, in small, deliciously ironic ways. The new board repealed half of Karen's stupidest rules within the first month. Flags could stay up all year if you wanted. Grass could be 3 inches. Someone even painted their shutters a daring shade of soft gray, and the sky didn't fall. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid me now stopped to chat. Awkward at first, then genuine. Mrs. Abernathy brought over a casserole with a handwritten note that said, "I'm so sorry I believed the lies." I accepted it with a smile and quietly donated the casserole to the local shelter. Some apologies taste better reheated. David tried one half-hearted text a few weeks after the hearing. "Can we talk about this like adults?" Sophie blocked his number before I even saw it. She told me later, voice steady, "He doesn't get to rewrite history anymore." I didn't argue. Some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt. They're meant to be left smoldering so everyone can see the smoke and remember why they burned. As for me, I finally allowed myself to breathe. I planted flowers in the front yard, bright, cheerful ones that would have sent Karen into cardiac arrest. I hung the American flag until the fabric frayed. And most importantly, I started telling Sophie the little stories I'd kept locked away. How terrified I'd been in the hospital. How I'd cried in the recovery room, not from pain, but from the fear that I'd lost her forever, even while saving her life. She listened without interrupting, then hugged me and whispered, "I wish I'd known sooner, but I'm glad I know now." The healing wasn't linear. There were still nights she cried about all the birthdays I'd missed, all the school plays where she'd scan the audience hoping I'd show up. There were nights I lay awake wondering if my silence had been the right choice after all. But every time doubt crept in, I'd remember that 8-year-old girl's face in the hospital bed and know I'd do it again in a heartbeat. Love sometimes looks like absence when the alternative is a lifetime of debt. A full year after the hearing, I sat in a crowded university auditorium, the air buzzing with excitement and the smell of cheap gowns and fresh starts. Sophie walked across the stage, diploma in hand, cap tassel swinging. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she looked straight into the crowd, found my eyes, and smiled. The same smile she used to give me before the transplant, before the lies, before Karen turned our family into collateral damage. That smile said everything the courtroom never could. We made it. We're still here. Later that night, we sat on my porch, the one with the now legal porch swing, and watched the sun set over Willow Creek. The neighborhood looked exactly the same on the surface, but underneath it was different. Lighter. Freer. And for the first time in 15 years, I felt like I could finally exhale without checking the mailbox for another certified letter. Sophie leaned her head on my shoulder. "You know what the craziest part is?" she said softly. "All those years Karen preached about sacrifice for the community, and the biggest sacrifice in this entire neighborhood was the one nobody ever knew about. Yours." I smiled into the twilight. "The best sacrifices don't need applause, sweetheart. They just need to work." We sat there until the streetlights flickered on, perfectly timed, perfectly HOA approved. And for the first time, I didn't feel like an outsider in my own neighborhood. I felt like a mother, a neighbor, a survivor. And somewhere across town, in her rule-free condo, I hoped Karen Blackwell was staring at her own beige walls, wondering how the woman she tried to destroy had ended up with everything she tried to take. Because in the end, the real power in Willow Creek wasn't the one with the clipboard. It was the one who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. And that, folks, is a story even the strictest HOA can't find a way.